The judge watched himself take a bribe, on screen in open court. The room went dead silent. But what happened next changed everything. First, let's go back to the beginning. The courtroom air was stale and still, yet charged like a thunderstorm about to break. Derek Matthews sat motionless at the defendant's table, hands clenched into fists against his thighs. His skin, deep brown and glistening with a thin sheen of sweat, contrasted sharply with the pale oak paneling surrounding him, a visual reminder of just how out of place he'd been made to feel. This wasn't a trial, not in the true sense. It was a ritual, a slow, formalized execution of character. From the beginning, Derek had insisted on his innocence. The non-profit they claimed he'd embezzled from wasn't just his job, it was his legacy. He co-founded it to help underserved youth in Atlanta's West End, many of whom reminded him of the boy he once was, bright, angry, underestimated. For 7 years, he'd poured everything into it: sweat, sleep, sanity. So when those accusations surfaced, falsified invoices, missing checks, it didn't just threaten his freedom. It threatened the very identity he'd spent years building. But none of that mattered here. Judge Alan Corwin loomed high above the courtroom, flanked by the seal of the state and the brittle weight of decades of unchecked authority. His expression remained unreadable, but not indifferent. No, it was something worse, calculated, settled, as though the machinery of justice had been oiled well in advance, the gears already turning long before evidence was presented or witnesses took the stand. Every gavel strike, every sustained objection in favor of the prosecution, every narrowed glance toward Derek's table, it all accumulated like dust, suffocating the room's already fragile sense of fairness. Across the aisle, the prosecutors looked smug, not triumphant. Smug. They knew. You could see it in their posture. They'd been playing with loaded dice the whole time. Bryce Wilkins sat in the gallery 2 rows back, arms crossed, face impassive. The man had everything to lose if Derek walked out of that courtroom free. A lucrative development deal, his hand-picked leadership at the non-profit, and the narrative he'd spun for investors about Derek being difficult to manage. When the jury returned, 12 faces drained of complexity, Derek didn't flinch, but his wife, Alana, did. She gripped his arm until the words, "guilty on all counts," came down like a hammer on glass. She folded over with a gasp, shoulders shaking. Their son, barely old enough to grasp the weight of the word felony, stared up at her in alarm. And Corwin? He didn't blink. He just made a mark on his notepad, flipped the page, and moved on. They tried to bury it quickly. The sentencing hearing was scheduled with unsettling speed, skipping past motions and deliberations like stones across water. Derek Matthews sat again before Judge Alan Corwin, but this time with a different kind of silence behind his eyes. Not the stillness of fear, but the numbness of betrayal calcified into resignation. 15 years. That was the number. It hit like a blunt instrument, not designed to kill, only to crush. In the city's margins, voices rose. Activists, pastors, law students, those who'd seen too many Dereks swallowed by machinery too old and too white to be reformed from within, called it what it was, a judicial hit job. But the anger was scattered, flickering like brush fire in the wind. It needed fuel. And that fuel arrived in the form of a whistle no one saw coming. Riley Monroe was no revolutionary. She wasn't known for loud speeches or courtroom standoffs. She was quiet, precise. The kind of assistant who knew where every file was and what coffee the judge liked. Black, no sugar. But she also knew where the cracks in the walls were, knew how Corwin's chambers went mysteriously off calendar for hours, knew when a sealed folder was replaced without reason, and she knew what she'd seen. The encrypted messages she leaked weren't guesses. They were timestamps. threads between Corwin and Bryce Wilkins, the man who should never have had access to a judge's inbox. The messages were masked in euphemisms. Expedite the process, contain the optics, keep the verdict clean. But to anyone who lived in the real world, the meaning was blunt and bloody. A conviction was being prearranged like a hotel booking. Local news caught it, ran quick segments, invited lukewarm legal experts to speculate politely. Corwin released a statement calling the accusations laughable. Riley was dismissed within 48 hours. Bryce called it an ugly attempt to derail justice. Most viewers shook their heads, sighed, then moved on. After all, corruption didn't shock anymore. It was wallpaper. But Riley wasn't finished. One night, with no warning, she posted the video, raw footage from the security camera outside Corwin's private chambers. No sound, just the two men. The handshake, the envelope. A leather brown envelope, thick and deliberate, sliding across the desk like a silent confession. Bryce nodding, Corwin leaning in. Then both of them walking out in opposite directions. That clip, 37 seconds, detonated the internet. The hashtags came like shrapnel. #Corwin bribe, #judicial fix, #free Derek. The rage wasn't just digital. It was visceral. It was ancestral. The kind of rage that doesn't ask for permission. The silence had finally been broken. Not with a scream, but with proof. The courthouse smelled different that morning, like sweat, heat, and something bitter rising from beneath the marble floors. A crowd had already gathered outside by dawn, spilling down the steps with handmade signs and quiet fury. Inside, the atmosphere was sharper, stripped of its usual pageantry. The public benches were packed wall to wall, the press crammed into every available corner. The bailiff's voice cracked, just trying to bring the room to order. But everyone was waiting for one thing: the moment Judge Alan Corwin would face the defendant he'd tried to erase. Derek Matthews sat calmly at the defense table, but his stillness carried tension like a tightly wrapped spring. His face was leaner now, harder around the eyes. Gone was the clean-shaven optimism of a man trying to prove his worth to a system. What sat there now was something colder, the weight of betrayal worn like armor. Beside him stood Jordan Kelly, his new attorney, young, black, sharp-tongued, and utterly unafraid. There was no pretense to her presence. She wasn't there to negotiate. She was there to bury. At the bench, Corwin entered in silence. He looked smaller than before. Same robe, same gavel, but different posture. The arrogant tilt of his chin was gone, replaced by the sag of someone who knows the trap he built is now his own. The motion to vacate wasn't just a formality. It was a reckoning. The courtroom screen flickered to life as Jordan tapped the space bar with quiet rage. The footage played again. The handshake, the envelope. No commentary needed. It had already been dissected by millions, frame by damning frame. Then came Jordan's voice, slicing through the air like a scalpel. "Tell me, Your Honor, is this justice? Or is this what it looks like when power is bought and sold?" She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every syllable landed with surgical precision. Corwin didn't answer. He shifted, twitched. His fingers gripped the arms of his chair like they were slipping. For a full 30 seconds, the silence was total. Even the courtroom camera crew seemed to stop breathing. It wasn't just a pause, it was exposure. A man who had spent decades delivering judgment was, for the first time, drowning in it. Then he stood. Not with dignity, not with authority, but with the brittle clumsiness of someone realizing the ground beneath him had turned to ash. "I hereby recuse myself permanently," he said, voice cracking. "And I resign." And just like that, The robe became nothing more than fabric. No gavel slam, no grand exit. Just a broken man stepping away from a throne made of lies. The morning air was warm, but not generous. It clung to the skin, heavy with the weight of too many unspoken stories. Derek Matthews stood on the courthouse steps, not in chains, not in a jumpsuit, but in the same dark suit he'd worn on the first day of his trial. It didn't hang the same way anymore. It bore the creases of confinement, the sun-faded shoulders from time spent behind glass, and a looseness at the collar that mirrored a man no longer seeking to fit into anyone else's frame. The doors behind him clicked shut. The courthouse, once a symbol of accusation, now stood awkwardly silent. Around him, reporters formed a semicircle, microphones extended like bayonets. Flashbulbs flickered without rhythm, capturing a face no longer pleading for understanding, but offering something harder to define, something earned. The question came quickly, sharp and direct. What do you want to say to the people who put you in that cell? Derek didn't rush his answer. He didn't smile. He didn't blink. His gaze locked onto the nearest camera, and by extension, every living room, every phone screen, every desk chair tuned in. I forgive the system, he said, voice low but unwavering. But I won't forget, and I won't stop. No dramatic music, no slow clap from the crowd, just silence. Then a quiet shift. A few people nodded. Not the enthusiastic kind. The kind of nod that comes from having seen too much, from recognizing not just the pain of survival, but the grit it takes to keep going afterward. No celebration, no triumph, just acknowledgement. Riley Monroe watched from across the plaza. She wasn't behind a podium. She wasn't giving interviews. She stood beside a folding table stacked with pamphlets about judicial accountability, her name tag peeling slightly in the sun. She hadn't returned to court. She'd chosen a different battlefield, the kind that never makes the headlines, but shifts the ground beneath them. Inside the building, Judge Corwin's nameplate had already been removed. The investigation into his rulings had started like a whisper, but it was gaining mass. Files were being pulled, old cases reopened, and in the county jail, Bryce Wilkins sat without bail. His expensive suit traded for state-issued gray, his phone calls monitored, his legacy unraveling stitch by stitch. But Derek wasn't watching any of that. He just stood there, chest rising, eyes steady. Because sometimes victory doesn't explode. Sometimes it exhales.